October of 1904, incumbent Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier was campaigning for re-election. After his initial victory in 1896 over Conservative Charles Tupper, who had only been Prime Minister for a few months after his predecessor's resignation, he had led the Liberal Party to another easy majority in 1900. So while he was in Ontario, an important province that actually had a slim Conservative majority by some 20 seats, he gave a campaign speech in Massey Hall in Toronto on October 14th. He talked about how the previous 8 years had brought notable prosperity and recognition to the country, while also denying any responsibility for it himself, and how a renewed Liberal government would promise to continue this prosperity for another 4 years. But what he said next was a little bolder. I tell you nothing but what you know when I tell you that the 19th century has been the century of American development. The past 100 years have been filled with the pages of her history. Let me tell you, my fellow countrymen, that all the signs point this way, that the 20th century shall be the century of Canada and Canadian development. For the next 70 years, nay, for the next 100 years, Canada shall be the star towards which all men who love progress and freedom shall come. This quote would be immortalized in Canadian history, paraphrased as, the 20th century belongs to Canada. A lot has changed in the 120 years since Laurier made that speech. For Laurier himself, he won the 1904 election, with notably more seats in Ontario in particular, and continued to lead the country until he lost to Conservative leader Robert Borden in 1911 over his free trade deal with the United States, which the Conservatives said would lead to American domination over our economy. This may or may not be foreshadowing. He continued to remain leader of the opposition until he died of a stroke on February 17, 1919. He would be succeeded in that position by his former Minister of Labour, some guy named William Lyon Mackenzie King. And for Canada as a whole, well, think about it this way. The American Revolution established the United States as a country around 1776, but Canada remained a part of the United Kingdom for another century. In fact, we didn't gain our own independence until 1867. That's only a little over 150 years ago. Most of our history as an independent country happened in those 120 years. The entirety of World War I, the Great Depression, that guy with a mustache taking over Europe, the Cold War, the US invading every country in the Middle East that didn't have nukes, that all happened since Laurier said the 20th century belonged to Canada. And with those 120 years of perspective, we can take a critical look back at Canada's history and decide for ourselves if the 20th century really belonged to Canada. And I say that, despite what Laurier said, Canada did not become a non-dependent, unified country in pursuit of peace during the 20th century. Here's why. For starters, let's jump not too far into the 20th century, just to 1917. The Conservative PM I mentioned earlier, now Sir Robert Borden, had just recently been to Europe, quite famous for being the continent on which were fought the two wars we learned about in history class. Notably, after visiting wounded soldiers off the Western Front of World War I, Borden resolved that the suffering of Canadian peoples had to end now. His solution to that? Throwing more Canadian peoples at said Western Front. So in August, Borden's government announced a new policy of conscription, breaking a promise he'd given at the start of the war in 1914. Now, as you might know, Canada has two official languages, English and French, which also represent the two groups of white people that stole the land and kept it to this day. The English people were mostly cool with conscription, but the French were definitely not. The first French pioneers, such as Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain, were exploring Canada as early as the 16th and 17th centuries, and the British conquest of North America and the 7 Years' War made it very hard for French Canadians to retain contact with their home continent without going through those dirty Englishmen. Therefore, Canada's Francophones became very isolated from Europe's Francophones, as opposed to English Canadians who were still emigrating from England in the early 1900s. So when Borden forced the Francophones to go fight in someone else's war in someone else's continent, needless to say, they weren't too happy about it. Unrest in the French-speaking areas of Canada led Borden to call an election, and voters in Quebec, Canada's biggest Francophone province, voted overwhelmingly for the anti-conscription opposition. However, one thing I've forgotten to mention, intentionally, is that Quebec might be Canada's only Francophone province, and in the rest of Canada, things were a little different. Furious, the people of Quebec took action. On April 1st, 1918, the Canadian government deployed thousands of soldiers to quell the riots, particularly in Quebec City. The soldiers faced mass resistance and eventually had to open fire, killing 4 people. The fact that the Canadian government, while in the midst of fighting a war, had to deploy soldiers to fight its own citizens shows a strong divide within the country, in this case between English and French Canadians. While there has basically always been a rift between these two groups, ever since the British took over New France and changed all the place names, I think Sir Robert Borden escalated the situation with his need to end the war now, which, by the way, it did that same year, after barely a quarter of conscripts had even made it to Europe. While this may be the most evident case of English-French division within Canada, it is nowhere near the only case. Groups advocating for Quebec to leave Canada entirely have been popular in that province forever, most notably the Front de Libération du Québec, who in 1970 kidnapped two prominent Quebecois politicians and eventually killed one of them. At one point, a referendum for Quebec to leave the country was proposed in the province, and it almost passed by the slimmest of margins if it hadn't been for the work of Prime Minister Jean Chrétien to keep the country together. This, by the way, happened in 1995, as in the end of the 20th century. And when it comes to prime ministers that contradicted their own statements, how about my personal pick of Stephen Harper, Prime Minister of Canada from 2006 to 2015, who, in 2008, finally apologized on behalf of the government for Canada's role in the assimilation of Indigenous peoples, and then, in 2012, named a highway in Ottawa after the guy who adopted the boarding school system, which would go on to cause a huge part of that assimilation. Not a great guy. I'm so glad they finally renamed that highway. Okay, so Canada's maybe a bit divided internally, but now let's turn to external relations. First, let's look at Canada's economic diversity, or lack thereof. Well, that's not quite true. We do trade with most of the world, including being part of 15 trade agreements with 51 separate countries. But Canada definitely has a bit of a bias. Oh, hey, it's the United States. Our neighbor to the south represented almost 2/3 of imports and over 3/4 of exports across the first 9 months of last year. Fourth quarter data haven't released yet. And as Wikipedia succinctly puts it, the Canadian economy is closely integrated with the American economy. Most would say this relationship is bidirectional, with Canada also being the US's second largest trading partner. But their trading is undoubtedly more mixed. If America lost all its Canadian trades, they'd lose 1/5 of all imports and exports. Definitely a huge crisis, but comparatively not quite so bad. If we lost the US, we'd basically be screwed. This fact has played into essentially all of Canada's big decisions since World War II, such as the one I'm about to tell you about. The year is 1963, and Conservative Prime Minister John Diefenbaker is not having a good time. Last year's election saw his parliament fall from the largest majority government in Canadian history into a minority government, which, for all you Americans watching this, means he's still the Prime Minister due to having the largest representation of any party, but that he doesn't have enough representation to be able to pass legislation without consulting the other parties, which can happen because in Canada we have more than 2 political parties. Members of the Conservative Party had been questioning his leadership ever since. Not to mention, President John F. Kennedy of the United States had been getting on Canada's case for their lack of nuclear missiles for some time, and also for Diefenbaker's hesitance to put Canadian forces on high alert during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now enter Lester Bowles Pearson, leader of the Liberal Party. Pearson and the Liberals had stated previously that they were against nuclear missiles in Canada. But in 1962, their defense critic wrote a memorandum saying it would be politically beneficial to change their opinion. Eventually, pressures got too high for Diefenbaker, and he called an election in the spring of '63, in which the question of nuclear missiles was the biggest thing on either party's agenda. When the votes were counted, Pearson had defeated the bunk, and by the end of the year, we had nukes in Canada. By the way, that memorandum, the one that changed Pearson's mind, its key points were that if they didn't institute bombs, they would lose influence in NATO and face the reduction or termination of defense sharing agreements with the United States. Let me repeat that. We let weapons of mass destruction set to go boom in our country so we could stay on good terms with the United States. That's how bad our dependence on America is, economically and militarily. How can we be the star towards which all men of freedom and progress shall come, when our freedom and progress has always been dominated by our neighbors, which, I will mention, are indisputably one of the greatest economic and military superpowers of the entire world? Much more 20th century belongs to them material. Alright, I guess our economy's a bit monogamous. Well, how about our non-economic relations? Surely the star of freedom and progress is going to be on good terms with other countries, right? Well, in 2018, Canadian authorities were told, after pressure from the United States, to arrest the chief financial officer of Huawei, Meng Wanzhou, under charges that Huawei's subsidiary was violating US sanctions on Iran. Meng was changing flights at an airport in Vancouver, and she was placed under house arrest in Vancouver until her case was resolved in 2021. 9 days after her arrest, China detained 2 Canadian citizens, both named Michael for some reason, under accusations of espionage. That year, Canadian exports to China dropped by around 5 billion Canadian dollars, and Chinese foreign direct investment towards Canada were cut by nearly half. A similar thing happened very recently with India, after Canada claimed the Indian government had a role in the murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. Already simmering tensions between the two countries began to boil, bringing their foreign relations to an all-time low. A former Indian ambassador claims that Canada's support of these lawless elements has enabled a pursuit of a violent agenda, and that Canada must control such elements with a firm hand, and cannot allow them to foster terrorism and violence in India. One Indian reporter went so far as to claim our Prime Minister had become the next Imran, referring to a famous politician in Pakistan. So I guess Canada's just not good at foreign relations then. To be fair, these are countries that are very different from the traditional West politically and culturally. But isn't that also how a country's success in foreign relations should be measured? By how well it gets along with other countries? Have you ever heard anything in the news about India getting mad at, say, France? How about Australia? Canada and Australia, despite being on opposite sides of the globe, have a lot of similarities in their history and current status, and Australia is geographically much closer to China and India. And yet, Canada currently appears to be their political punching bag. Interestingly, both of these crises have happened within the last decade or so, under the leadership of our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. From what I've seen, a lot of Canadians seem to dislike Justin Trudeau. Son of the highly acclaimed Pierre Trudeau, Justin came into power as Prime Minister in 2015 after defeating Stephen Harper, that guy who named a highway after a racist. And I think that's an unfortunate pattern in Canadian politics. Think about it. Sir Robert Borden came into power as the first Conservative to win an election since our first Prime Minister only when Canadians got sick of Laurier. Diefenbunker won his first election against Louis Saint-Laurent by running a campaign that was basically were nothing like the Liberals. Harper was running in 2006 against widely unpopular PM Paul Martin. And when people finally realized that he probably wasn't that cool, they replaced him with Trudeau. And now that everyone seems to be done with Trudeau, who do you think's going to win the next election? In Canadian politics, it always seems like the choices are the lesser of two evils. In the US, that's definitely true. It's either the old man who is kinda good as vice president, or the rich guy who's very, very racist but also has super hardcore fans as if he's like a boy band or something. Oh wait, actually there's that more racist guy who'd actually know what to do if he got elected. The thing is, here in Canada, that's not true. Canada's elections are not between two choices. That's how minority governments happen. And right now, our best third option is the New Democratic Party, the NDP. The NDP is actually the party that helped Pierre Trudeau pass all those cool things everyone remembers him for. And apparently Trudeau Sr. actually considered joining the NDP, but didn't think they could ever win an election. Speaking of which, have you ever heard of the spoiler effect? In a voting system where there can only be one winner, it doesn't really matter who came in second or third or 10th, only the one party that won. When a third party enters that race, anyone that votes for them effectively spoils their vote, taking it away from the front-running party that they would have voted for instead, making the party furthest from their political views more likely to win. This discourages voters from voting third parties and explains why, despite almost always having more than two options, prime ministers have only ever come from the Liberals or the Conservatives. One of Trudeau Jr.'s methods for distinguishing himself from Harper was to promise that, upon getting elected, he would change the voting system to make it more fair. Well, this seems all fine and dandy, except that when Trudeau got elected, he found out changing the voting system would make it much less likely he could become Prime Minister again, since everyone would just vote NDP. So, since clearly there's no way we can trust our politicians to change the voting system and fix all our problems, we, the people of Canada, will need to rise up and take it ourselves. If everyone agrees to unite together as one party of the masses, and everyone joins Vote for Your Vote, which you can do at voteforyourvote.com. Politics is messy, and we can't understand the minds of the people in power that make decisions. Most of the things I said about why politicians did the things they did were just guesses. But one thing is crystal clear. The results of these actions have divided Canada on linguistic borders, have made us subservient to our only land neighbour, apart from on Hans Island, and have worsened our relationship with several global powers, particularly recently. So no, I don't agree with Laurier when he said the 20th century belonged to Canada. I don't think Canada did all too well these past 120 years. Heck, we still even had residential schools until 1996. If you don't know what those are, don't look them up. Despite what Laurier said, Canada did not become a non-dependent, unified country in pursuit of peace during the 20th century. Let's hope the change is possible in the century still to come. Thank you for watching this video on YouTube. I know I said I quit and stuff, but this is a cool video that I made and I want to share it with you guys. Please note that this is for a school project and that there are several ways you could argue this point, including arguing against it. Don't think that Canada sucks just because I mentioned the October crisis and that thing with China in 2018. We're a cool country, probably better than the United States, as you might have been able to catch on. But also, screw Stephen Harper. That guy sucks.